right, what's up, guys, and welcome to our first official episode of the Biomed Bros Podcast. My name is Joe, and I'm here with my co-host, David, and today what we're going to talk about is just kind of generally what we learned in our first year of medical school and some realistic expectations for people that might be starting medical school, towards the end of this summer. So I guess I'll start. So one thing that I learned just right off the top of my head is that medical school is exactly what I expected.
What does that mean?
In that it is hard and it takes work every single day and all day, right? Like there's some people that, you can see that, they make Instagram posts or different things, and they're like, man, I never expected medical school to be this hard. And I'm like, what are you talking about, bro? How did you not expect it to be hard? They're going in like, oh, I thought I was gonna breeze through and it was gonna be amazing, and I'm gonna match at Johns Hopkins into neurosurgery, and it's gonna be dandelions and daisies. I went in knowing, I was like, this is going to be hard.
Yep.
And it was.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, that's fair, because, I don't know. We've both watched a lot of YouTube before going into med school. Yep. So, what did you see on YouTube and, on Instagram specifically that kind of gave you the impression that it was going to be hard as opposed to what people kind of portray it as?
I think, so when I was starting, I was searching YouTube for people that were kind of within my same, starting point, people that were also getting ready to start medical school, so I could see what they were talking about, but also people that had just finished their first year, so kind of where we're at now. And so I watched them, I watched their old videos of, first day of medical school, and then, watch, halfway through the year if they would post an update video, and you could kind of just see the tiredness on some people's faces.
Man. Yeah.
And I'm like, watching these people, they seem so bright and so outgoing, and their energy was contagious. You're like, man, these are great YouTubers, I want to watch them. But then you could kind of see them just being tired.
Yep.
And I'm like, man, if somebody like that is seemingly tired and you can almost see a little bit of burnout, I'm like, what is that going to mean for me?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I think that it's so funny. People really don't want to look like they're struggling or doing anything that's difficult. I mean, we want to portray this idea that we are someone good to everyone, which makes sense. I mean, why wouldn't we? Who do you have a YouTuber that you think of when you think of that, or is it
not off the top of my head, because I watched sporadically a few different people, and I can't really remember their names off the top of my head, but it was quite a few of them, and this also kind of happened to us because, which we failed to mention in our pilot, we've been trying to get the Biomed Bros as some type of social media type of deal. We've been working on this for a long time.
Yeah, it's been at least a year.
It's been at least a year.
So.
We started talking about it last summer, around when we were about to graduate with our master's degrees, and school kind of just hits you.
Oh yeah.
And differences in schedules. It's okay, I might have the next week free, but David might have an exam the next week.
Exactly.
So he's just in the trenches, just grinding every single day, but I might have been more free. And then, the reverse happens. So, it's much harder. And I get that in terms of the YouTubers that I would be watching, where, the first week of school, they might be daily vlogging, whatever. You're like, yo, this is sick. And then boom, they just go dead for 3 or 4 months. And then they post an update video, I don't know, during Christmas break or something. Yep. They're like, oh, by the way, here's how it went. It's just time just flies, and you just lose the super extra time that you have in the summer we have right now. But
absolutely, yeah. Well, and that's the thing too. So when I started medical school, I think that I kind of didn't really process that it was going to be different than our grad school.
Sure.
Especially not like right before the first set of tests. So, you know, I knew it was going to be hard. I didn't know that it was going to be as much material as was going to happen.
True.
Like, because the goal of our master's program was basically, okay, we're going to go and get through the first year's worth of material of medical school, but spaced out over 2 years. And when you take all that material and you combine it into 1 year, it ends up looking kind of daunting by comparison to what it felt like. Although, to be fair, you know, even in 2 years, like, things can get daunting.
Yeah.
So that first week for me, what was the first week for you like?
Oh,
like, tell me. Yeah, like,
it was terrible.
Yeah.
So here's another difference that we kind of mentioned in like the pilot episode. David has been in person all year, but my school remained online.
Yes.
I was online this entire year. And so my first week of school, I didn't leave my apartment once. It might have actually been 2 weeks. 2 weeks straight that I did not leave my apartment even once.
Dude.
Just because, you know, you pile up this mass of things that you need to do on your daily schedule, and, you know, I plan out almost every single hour of my day, and you just lose track of time. And so before I knew it, I was like, whoa, it's been like a whole week, and I'm exhausted, and I didn't do anything. Like, I didn't leave the house. I was like, I need to get groceries. I also need to be like an adult human being and like do something like other than like school. So that was crazy, but the first week was horrible.
Yeah, totally fair. I mean, it was because and did you have orientation right to start out before the
whole
first
week before?
Yeah. You know, similar for me, they were like, okay, we're going to bring you in, we're going to have orientation week, it's going to be great, it's going to be chill, and then everything's going to start, right?
Yes.
And it did. Like,
and it's not like there's no welcome day.
No.
Orientation is welcome day.
Yeah.
It's like orientation and then you start.
Yep.
There's no like learning curve.
Not really.
No.
You know, they're I just remember distinctively the first day that I walk in, you know, they start giving us these lectures on like, this is how, you know, we're going to do things, this is professionalism, like all this stuff. And you don't really think, okay, this is what med school was going to be like. So it's a shock to the system.
Right.
You know? And then after that week is done, it really starts hitting.
Yes.
Because you start getting material. And it's like, oh my gosh, you know, last week we were just talking about how my computer works that they gave me or whatever. And now
we're neck deep in, you know, cellular mechanical pathways and biochem and everything. It's just like, how did I get here?
Totally. Who am I?
Also, you know, talking about our master's degree, kind of the difference, you know, it was marketed to us where they were like, you get through this program and it will prepare you for medical school.
Yeah.
I agree, and I also disagree.
Oh, yeah.
I don't think that I would have been as successful as I was this year without it, because there's so many things that I remembered from the master's degree. But the pace and the depth was different, at least for me.
Oh, crazy different.
So in our master's degree, for a lot of it, we took one course at a time, and a lot of it, we only had class every other day. And so my workflow would be like, okay, go to class the day we had class, and then I would go home and like do work, because I taught as well, so I would prepare for teaching the next day or whatever. And then the next day, I would look at the lecture from the previous day, and then, you know, you had so much more free time. But David taught his second year as well, and so you know more, like the teaching part filled up a lot of your space.
Oh yeah.
But teaching is a lot different than studying for medical school.
Oh.
So
without a doubt.
So our schedules did end up being like similar to what they are in terms of like the time amount of your day. It's just used differently. Like nowadays in medical school, you just study.
Yep.
Like I sat in my chair for like 14 hours a day and just studied. But yeah, so that was different than medical school. Like the pacing and the depth was different as well.
Yeah.
Because, you know, if you're going into medical school, most likely they'll start off with a foundations type of class. That's where all of your genetics and biochem and cell biology are going to be. However, in that class, which it was like 6 weeks for you, right? Or was it 8?
Yeah, no, it was 6.
Okay.
It was 6 for me.
Yeah, it was 6 for me as well, split up into like 2 different parts. But that's where we covered all of our cell biology. And in our master's degree, we went so much further in depth in everything for cell biology than we did in medical school.
Yep.
So there in graduate school, even though the pace was slower, there was way more depth. Mm-hmm. But in medical school, there's just way more information, but maybe not as deep.
Yeah. And that's kind of weird too, because like, you know, maybe before you go to med school, they will be talking about, okay, we're going to, in medical school, you're going to be seeing all of these pathways and you'll have to know everything this deep. And like, it's going to be, you know, if you don't know every single enzyme in this cell, you're going to die and you're going to kill a patient. But this is from like a PhD.
Right.
And not to talk down on PhDs, right? But they have a very specific mindset when they're looking at stuff that is different from like a doctor, like a physician. So, you know, it's very weird because you're right. It was like kind of skin deep on a lot of things that we went deep on, but that were spread out over time.
Right.
So like, I don't know. I think an example for me was like mTOR.
Yes.
The professor that we had would go all the way through this pathway. We'd see everything from insulin all the way down to cellular effects and then some stuff in the body. Whereas in med school, our PhD guy was like, you need to know that this is mTOR and that it causes this thing in the body.
Right.
And there's all of this machinery that's in between that nobody
cares about.
Worries it. Yeah, they just don't worry about it.
Except for the PhD that studied it and wrote a dissertation about it.
Exactly. And then they'll, you know, in grad school, they'll ask you questions about it. But in medical school, they just want to know, you know, do you know how this is going to affect the body, right? At the end of the day. But even that's a little weird. Like, how would you say med school expectations on what they were interested in during first year was like? Did you think that it matched up with your conception of it?
I definitely think so, because especially like in our second year of our master's degree, I was getting kind of sick of it because I'm like, I don't care about every single tiny bit of this stupid pathway.
Yep.
I was like, give me something clinical.
Yeah.
And so my hopes for medical school were that they would cut out the fluff. Mm-hmm. And they would relate everything clinically. And for me, that's exactly how it was, and I liked it so much better. Like in biochemistry, so in graduate school, our biochem exams were mostly written. And so he would give us a packet, and you'd flip through the packet, and it would say, you know, on one page, draw all of glycolysis. Mm-hmm. And then the next page was like, draw the entire TCA cycle. Mm-hmm. And then the next page, draw the entire pentose phosphate pathway. And I'm like, oh my gosh, you know, and it took forever to memorize that.
Yeah, 100%.
You know, we'd whiteboard for hours and just draw it over and over and over again, preparing for the exam. When I get to medical school, on the first day of, you know, any time we talked about anything biochemistry, they were like, do not memorize every single, you know, substrate in this pathway.
Yep.
They were like, know the big stuff, know the inhibitors, know how this relates clinically, and know like the regulated steps. Mm-hmm. And, you know what happens if there is a defect and where the defect is if I presented this patient clinically. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, thank goodness. Then you see the people that didn't heed that advice and did draw every pathway over and over and over and over and over. And, you know, not one of my biochem questions this year on any exam were they like, what is the 10th step of the TCA cycle?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's they wanted you to know the clinical stuff. So mm-hmm. again, that was another kind of learning curve, because in our brains we were so ingrained of learning that particular way. Mm-hmm. Like, okay, if I just sit here for 3 hours and draw glycolysis over and over and over again, I'll be able to vomit it all over my exam and get all the points that I need.
Yeah.
But in medical school, it's different because you couldn't just memorize stuff. You really had to know it, because that's the type of questions that they ask.
Yeah, well, and so talk about that for just a second. Like, what do you mean when you say memorize versus knowing?
Yeah. So the big thing is, like, very stereotypically in undergrad, where you say, like, you take an exam, and then you're like, oh, I just, wrote everything down that I remembered, and then an hour later, I just forgot everything, right? That's because it wasn't, like, ingrained in you, and you didn't actually know the information, you just memorized it. In medical school, that can get you so far, but it can come back to bite you pretty quickly. Medical school is like an everyday grind where you have to learn something every single day. And you can't really have a day where, you do nothing, because it's really hard to catch up.
Oh, yeah.
And so if you start to play catch up, then you start to get into old habits of cramming. And cramming does not work in medical school, because in undergrad, you might have like 7 PowerPoints on an exam or whatever. Maybe like they're like 50 slides
that
each.
That seems high.
Yeah, maybe.
Like, I don't
maybe
know.
like 5.
Yeah.
Like our students used to have like 3.
Yep.
It was like 3 PowerPoints on this test, and they were like losing their minds.
Absolutely.
I think the highest one of my exams this semester, I think I had 60 or 70 PowerPoints on one exam.
Well, and tell me about what your exam schedule looked like usually, because that can kind of play into what that'll look like for different people.
And again, this is a difference between my school and David's school, where they had exams very frequently, but we only have 1 exam per block. So the example is, we started with Foundations to Medicine, so we had Foundations to Medicine 1, that was 3 weeks, and then an exam. And then we did Foundations 2, that was another 3 weeks, and then exam. Then we did musculoskeletal. That was like 4 or 5 weeks, 1 exam. Dude. 1 exam at the very end. So I'll let you go ahead and tell your differences.
Well, yeah, when I hear that, that makes me uncomfortable, because I'm like not used to that schedule. So I'm like, oh gosh, like 60, PowerPoints on one exam would be terrifying, because my school's like, okay, occasionally we'll have 1 week exams, right? So, it'll be a big portion of our grade, but we've had, maybe, I don't know, maybe 15 or 20 PowerPoints that we've gone through at most, and that's on 1 exam, and they're all divided up. So, like, we'd have osteopathic foundations as its own exam, and we'd have our lecture exams, and we'd have our patient interaction exams, and they're all going to be different, but usually they're shorter by a whole lot. So I think that kind of the most consistent schedule would be about 2 weeks. Every 2 weeks we'd have an exam, and sometimes there'd be a few more PowerPoints, or sometimes there'd be a few fewer PowerPoints, but that's kind of the general. And I would say that in terms of the amount of material that you're hitting for those, that's pretty doable, right? The biggest problem that I would run into is, okay, I happen to be one of those people that doesn't want to schedule really effectively and efficiently, and this year has been a testament to how that can really impact your performance for me in some ways, because the weird thing in med school is you are not going to know everything walking into a test, no matter what you do. Unless you have a perfect memory and the conditions are absolutely spot on. It is super unlikely that you're going to walk into a test and get a 100 on everything. Unless it's like a checkoff, like a systems checkoff.
Right.
So, I mean, that's got to be one of the weirdest things for me, is that I've had to do a lot of changing of myself throughout this year because of the fact that I'm really bad at scheduling. And even that wasn't quite enough to make sure that I made it through this year without having to repeat it. So, when for those of you who are listening, if you're looking at this and thinking, oh, what the heck? Like, you can fail things in medical school. I mean, you totally can. I don't recommend it.
No.
But expect that things are going to be more frequent or more intense than you would have ever imagined it being an undergraduate. I don't know what programs like Stanford or whoever, the big ones end up doing when you're in undergrad. But I do know that they're probably not the same thing as walking into a medical institution, regardless of how high powered that program is. Yeah, I mean, what do you think of when you think, okay, like, how does the scheduling thing play into everything? Because for me, it would have made a huge difference. How do you lay out your day usually?
Yeah, so scheduling for me is super important because with medical school, you always have so much stuff in the back of your mind. You're like, you have like this mental checklist. You're like, okay, I need to do this, and this. Or like you go out to do groceries and you're like thinking, okay, when I get home, I need to do this and this and this. Like you're constantly thinking like that. But I found I would sometimes go to sit down after I've been worrying about studying all day. I would sit down to study and then I'm like, dude, I don't even know where to start. It's like, because there's so much. It's like, where do you begin?
Totally.
So that's why I was like, I need to schedule out like every single hour of my day. So what I did is my school send out a entire semester's schedule. So we have our schedule for the entire semester ahead of time. So I go through and, highlight everything that correlated to me, and I put that into my calendar on my MacBook. So then what I would do is behind my desk at home, I had a small whiteboard, and each night before I would go to bed, I would pull up my computer and look at my schedule. And so I would write everything on my whiteboard that was like for classes and whatnot. And I'm a huge Anki user, which we'll talk about later, but I would schedule when I would do my Anki. That was usually first thing in the morning. And then I would write in my schedules or small groups or labs and things like that. And then in all of the gaps, I would fill that in with something specific to study. So if I had, a lot of Anki cards to do that day and I wouldn't finish on my first go, I would schedule that in somewhere. I'm a big first aid user as well. So usually in the afternoons, I would schedule some time to read first aid. Or, I would schedule time to watch YouTube videos or like Boards and Beyond, something like that. But everything that I did was on my schedule. And if it wasn't on my schedule, it would not happen. I would even schedule, when I would do groceries, or when I was going to do my laundry or something. Like every single thing was scheduled for me, so I knew, okay, if I just look at my schedule and do one thing at a time and I follow it throughout the day, I'll feel like my day was successful. Because again, like the whole point of that, there's way too much to do to kind of not have a plan. At least for me at the beginning of the day. Some people I'm sure are good at like kind of going with the flow, but I would just get too lost. And so I had to schedule everything out very, precisely.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. That's really interesting. So when you're talking about like scheduling everything out, where do social things fall into that too? Because like that's got to be one of the most interesting things that we run into, or that at least I ran into, is, I don't know, social things can be either really helpful in kind of refreshing you a little bit, especially if you know when they're gonna be, and like there's kind of a, okay, we know what we're doing around this, and in that time frame that I'm doing a social event or whatever, I am not thinking about medical school. Like, it's not gonna happen. How do you go about figuring out when you want to do something like that, or how much is okay, and that kind of stuff?
It's a lot easier to do once you've been in school for a little while and you've seen what it's like. Again, it's just a scheduling thing. So generally, this whole past year, my quote unquote hanging out was very limited, except for us guys when we would get together, and usually we'd be studying, or grab coffee like one day for a couple hours or something. But for me, it has to do with prioritizing. And if this is the case of the people listening as well, who is the number one priority person that you need to prioritize besides yourself during medical school?
Oh, dude, it's got to be your significant other.
Your significant other. They are first.
100%.
So if you have a significant other, the person that you schedule that time with is them.
Without a doubt.
So the example, the example being what I did, and I'm pretty lucky. My now fiance, she's a PA. So she gets it. She gets the whole, lifestyle and everything. And so every Friday I would finish class, and we got out of class at around 5:30. So I'd finish class at 5:30. I would close my laptop and do nothing. Right? I would put all of that off, and Friday night we would make dinner or watch movies, or if anybody else was free, we might go hang out with them, stuff like that. But that's when you do that type of stuff. But I scheduled it in. It was every Friday night. And then, Saturday you have the more time to play catch up. In terms of like outside friends and stuff, if David would text me and be like, hey bro, you have time for coffee this week. I'd immediately pull up my calendar and look at it. And I would say, okay, so, I have a small group on Wednesday, but then Thursday, all I have is, class. And then, some study time in the evening. I was like, okay, I can go out and, we can hang out with David and, we'll get a little bit of studying done, but I have a little bit of spare time here. And so that's when we schedule it. But you just look for the places that might have some leeway. But like if I had a small group, which for my school, our small groups take a lot of like preparatory work. So if I had like a small group on Wednesday, I wouldn't be like, oh yeah, David, let's hang out for 3 hours on Tuesday night. Right? So you just have to be smart with like scheduling your time.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, that makes a lot of sense, because that's kind of how things went for me as well when I was trying to figure out whether or not I'm going to do something social. I had to take a look at the amount of stuff that was going on. And, for me, it was a little bit more, I guess, not inorganic, because, like, you have your calendar, you have things set out, you had this set up before you walked into med school.
Right.
I didn't have every single learning objective that we were going to cover before medical school, which meant that some of the planning has to take place a little bit on the back end whenever things started.
Right.
I'm not incredibly good at figuring out, okay, I'm going to do this, and this. I need kind of block type things. So when I would figure this out, like you're saying, first priority has got to be the wife.
Yes.
Or significant other, whoever's listening, you really do need to prioritize that relationship if you want to keep it.
Yeah.
Because I mean, my poor wife, she can tell you, there were times when I was like gunning it because I didn't know something and it was late, and she's like, dude, come to bed. You've been up so long, and I'm like, I know, but if I don't get this done, I'm gonna die. Yeah, yes, exactly. I need to.
I'm going to die.
So there has to be, like, number one, that understanding between you and your significant other that things are gonna be different, especially if they're not in this type of stuff too. Like, my wife is kind of medical. She's a speech pathology student, which means that she's getting that type of degree, and that degree has a whole lot of things going into it, but you could consider some of it to be slightly medical adjacent because you can work in either a school or in the hospital. So the schedule looks a little bit different, but for both of us, prioritizing that time together made everything doable, because at the end of the day, I'm coming home and I know that when I turn off my computer or whatever, or iPad or whatever, and we're actually getting to spend time together, I mean, she's there for me, I'm there for her, it's gonna be okay.
Yep.
Right? Regardless of how well the test went on Monday or how badly it went, that was so helpful just to have. Sure. So if you're walking into medical school with a significant other, that's a really, really helpful thing. And social stuff too, like, you have to know what things you can do in the time that you have, and whether or not it's going to be not possible. Like, and Joe and I had a slightly different experience there too. I ended up living about a half an hour away from medical school. And the people that I'd actually want to spend time with that are not my wife. So the prioritization of what can happen was super important. And sometimes that worked perfectly, and sometimes that didn't work perfectly.
Right.
And that's just, you have to roll with the punches. But the scheduling part of it would have been the most important factor for me overall, because even if I scheduled everything perfectly, but then decided not to follow my schedule because there's something out here that I want to go do, right? All my scheduling can fall apart if I throw a giant wrench into the works.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, that's something that everyone should start thinking about, especially if you're coming in for the first time, or even if you're in and you haven't made yourself a schedule and you feel like you're floundering. That can help you stay on track when everything else is going to be off. And let me ask you a question, Joe. So, do you think that Liz appreciated when you would specifically schedule time with her?
Yes.
Okay, tell me about that. Like,
because, she's a PA, right? So she went through PA school, super similar lifestyle and concepts and all this and that. So she gets it. And she would appreciate when I would just, close my laptop and then not think about it. We would, maybe chat. She would say, oh, what did you learn today? And we'd talk about it because she, knew all of that information better than I did. But, she would just appreciate the time where there was no school.
Yeah.
Because you can also easily ruin that time by if you're like, hey, let's watch a movie tonight, and then you have your iPad on your side and you're doing Anki cards.
Oh man.
While you're watching the movie. It's she would probably see that, and then it's not as fun for everybody. It's not as fun for you because you're not resting, and it's also going to be doubly not fun for you because then your significant other would be mad at you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, it's kind of like the what's the word? The intentionality of the time that you're spending with the person. I am going to drop everything because it's mutually beneficial.
Oh yeah.
It's beneficial for you because you're taking a break, which we could have an entire episode about taking a break.
Oh man.
But
we should actually.
We could. We absolutely could.
That's a good idea.
We'll put that on our list. But yeah, it's beneficial for you because you're taking a break, and it's beneficial for the both of you because you're keeping your relationship.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
Oh gosh.
But in terms of people that aren't in a relationship, let's say they breezed through medical school and hung out with friends every single day and would go out and party and this kind of stuff. Advice.
Oh man. Advice for people that are just single and going through? Yeah. I mean, I think the prescription of saying, yeah, you should definitely have a schedule is huge.
Yeah.
I think that if you're going through, and is this a person that came out of undergrad and did that?
Let's say they kind of squeaked through undergrad.
Yeah.
Your normal average medical student about to start straight out of undergrad.
Okay. Yes. My first thought when thinking about that is, okay, avert the expectation that everything is going to be as simple as it was in undergrad, right? And avert the expectation that you will have as much time, because time is your most precious resource. No matter what you're doing, especially here though, your time is super, super important.
Yep.
I would also say, especially when you're getting into the first day, try to talk to as many people as you possibly can.
Agree.
I don't know, the friends that you make in med school can be either really helpful or really tough to deal with, because let's say that you make some really superficial friends, or your friendship with someone is a superficial friendship. It's not deep, but you kind of feel like you want to study with them. It can be kind of tough to go out of your way and be like, oh wait, can I, I know that you're the only person that I know, can I study with you? And if they say no, then you feel isolated. Right? You don't want to be isolated in med school.
Sure.
This whole thing is a team effort.
Yep.
To some extent. You're going to have to work in teams with people at some point in your medical career. Even if you want to be a pathologist and you just want to work in the lab, you're going to be with people who are preparing specimens. You're going to be interacting with surgeons out there who are giving you samples. There's all these really important things that you have to do. So that networking is going to be super important.
Yep.
But again, I think that the most important thing when you walk in is to have appropriate expectations for what things look like.
Yeah.
Yeah, what do you think? What would you tell someone who's walking in and they've kind of had this breeze through undergrad, they made it into med school, and they're trying to figure out what to do?
Yeah. I would say definitely, it was different for me because I was online. But if I had the opportunity to, I would say like you said, make friends with as many people as you can. Mm-hmm. If you're one of those people that has, a really tight-knit friend group, maybe from undergrad, or people that are really close to you that aren't in the medical field.
Oh, yeah.
Be very careful with your yeses and your nos. Mm-hmm. I would say definitely do not be a yes man. Mm-hmm. Because, there's going to be nights where, you just finished class and maybe your group text starts blowing up and all your friends are like, hey, do you want to go out here? Do you want to go out here? Let's go do this, go do this, go do this. Mm-hmm. You cannot always say yes.
Yep.
You have to start learning when is appropriate to say yes, and more appropriately when it's time to say no.
100%.
Because the no's are going to be a lot more frequent than the yeses.
Oh yeah.
And it just, again, it just depends. And I'd also say, if a friend is like, hey, do you want to hang out this day? It doesn't have to be a no and then forget about it forever. It can be a no, but and then you can squeeze it in somewhere. Again,
absolutely.
You'll learn your schedule and what you can and can't do. And there's going to be some days where you just do not have the time. Mm-hmm. And hopefully, if the friend is a good enough friend, they would understand that.
Oh yeah.
But there's other times where you could say, I can't do it tonight, but my, Thursday night is a little bit more free. I have like an easier day, or, my Friday morning is good. Do you want to go grab coffee instead?
Yes.
Your no's don't have to be definitive no's because you also don't want to lose your friends.
Oh yeah. And that's the thing too. You need relationships outside of medical school.
Right.
I can't say how rough it would be if the only friends that I had right now were in med school.
Yeah.
Or at least in the same medical school. And let me clarify that, because sometimes the comparison feeling when you're in those kinds of groups can be really, really frustrating, and really daunting. Even if you're doing well in your class and so and so Joe Schmo over here is like, oh man, that last test was so hard. I only got a 96 or something like that, right? Like there's these people that you're going to interact with that you'd be really surprised by what they're saying, because it can be really uncomfortable. And the people that are outside the medical sphere entirely, or just outside at least your personal bubble of medical people, I can't tell you how valuable those friendships are because they keep you grounded.
Sure.
I've got a buddy who's back in California that I talk with, and one of the things that I think is super helpful about our friendship is that when I'm freaking the heck out about my test that maybe wasn't exactly where I wanted it to be, but it was still pretty decent, but I heard about someone else who had a much better score on that test. He's like, dude, I don't care. Let's just talk about this book that we've been reading,
right,
or this show that we've watched, or about life. It's life-giving. It's really helpful to have that.
Yep.
So don't sacrifice your relationships, but be willing to give them that line in the sand where you say, okay, look, I want to spend time with you. That no but is really that key phrase, I think. 'Cause, no but is probably the thing that we've said to each other so often this year.
A lot.
Yeah.
Because and our schedules are so different. Because like we mentioned before, I had an exam, sometimes it would just be once a month or maybe even a little bit longer than that depending on the block. Mm-hmm. But David would have exams, either every week or every other week. Mm-hmm. So, he'd be like, hey, do you want to get coffee, at some point, or do you want to study tomorrow night? I'd be like, I probably can't, but I'm free, this day.
Yeah.
Or I'd be like, oh, maybe we can, go to a coffee shop on, Saturday and, study for a couple of hours or something like that. Mm-hmm. It's, redirecting it. It's not saying, strictly no. Mm-hmm. Just redirect a little bit, because you do need that time.
Yeah.
Because you can get completely lost in the work and stuff too.
Yeah.
Because if you just say no, and then no and no and no and no, eventually people are going to stop asking.
Absolutely.
And then you end up alone.
Yep. And that's...
Which is sad.
Yeah, it's sad.
And it would make medical school way worse than it already is.
So much worse.
So.
Oh, it'd be terrible. Yeah. Oh my gosh. What, so, let's see. What else should we talk about?
So this one we're talking about just general things we learned during our first year.
Oh, man.
Okay, I got one.
Yeah, hit me.
We can, let's see. Okay, so this kind of blends into our next episode's idea, which is going to be studying advice.
Yes.
But just as like a preview, because this is a huge thing that I learned. In medical school, learn that day's material that day. Because every single day you learn something different. Like, you know, in your foundations type of class, one day you could have biochemistry, the next day is histology, the next day is genetics, the next day is, you know, pathology, the next day is cell biology, and then you bounce back to biochemistry. It's just every single day is different. But what really helped me is to learn that day's information that day. Because, again, you know, in comparison to like undergrad and graduate school, you know, you could go to class and then say, oh, you know, let's go hang out with my friends tonight. And then we'd go to like cookout for, you know, a couple of hours. And, you know, you're hanging out, you know, you're cutting up and all this and that. And then the next day, you know, you could find some, you know, sporadic free time to like study and stuff. And it wasn't that stressful. No. In medical school, you can't do that. So the way that I found to not fall behind is to learn that day's information that day. And then in the over the weekend, you can go back and review everything from that previous week. But that's a big one. That's a big thing that, in general, I learned during my first year.
That's huge. That's huge. And, you know, I tried to follow... It's funny, because we had that kind of conversation before we started the first week of classes. It was funny, because I think that we were sitting in your apartment and looking at like RemNote stuff, and I think that you were, I can't remember exactly, but you said, I don't remember if you saw it on a YouTube video or if you were just thinking about it, but like that really was something that I tried to think about during the year. It didn't always hold up. Sometimes you have to rehash things later and really get it. But that's got to be one of the most important things that anyone takes away. I hope that you take this away. If you're listening, please learn things the day that you get them. As much as possible, because your life will be way better.
And there's like some overlap and stuff too. Like, because I'm an Anki user, like, you know, my days would overlap a little bit, and we can talk about that more on another episode, just so we can kind of stay focused. But big picture in general, you know, if you have a lecture, don't look at it for the first time after the lecture like 3 days later.
Oh, that'll be so bad.
Somewhere within 24 hours of having that lecture. So like, let's say you have a lecture at, you know, 2 p.m. on Monday. Try to review that lecture before 2 p.m. on Tuesday.
Yes.
Like a 24-hour block
is a great window.
Is a good window. That's kind of what you want to shoot for when we say learn that day's material that day.
Yep, absolutely. And that might look a little bit different. Like, so Joe's lectures ended up being like later in the day. What, 2 to 5 usually? Yeah. And that kind of affected how his progression would look like, but he would still get the material in within that 24-hour period.
Exactly.
And with my lectures, you know, we'd have our lectures from somewhere between 8 and 5 p.m., so I'd usually head home and be able to kind of slap through a decent amount of the lectures that night, you know, within a margin of error.
Right.
And remember, every time that you're looking at this, everything has those error bars. Because different people are going to do this differently. And that's okay, you know, and expect that. What do you think about when people in med school are kind of talking about what they do day to day? How do you approach comparison when you're thinking about this? Because like expectations might be like, oh, we're all going to be buddies and it's going to be totally fine, and like but sometimes in med school it is not like that. How do you approach comparison, or how did you approach comparison this year?
I think the easy way to answer it is to not compare yourself, but innately as humans, you just do that.
Oh, yeah.
I think So you're talking about like comparing like exam scores or comparing like the way that you study?
I think maybe we should take them both individually.
Okay. So in terms of like comparing scores, I think a good thing to do is like before you start, set like a realistic expectation for where you want to be.
Mm-hmm.
So my school, all of the courses are pass fail. And so I said, okay, for this entire year, for my entire like semester, I either want to high pass it or get honors.
Mm-hmm.
Because we have, honors, high pass, pass, and then like not passing.
Okay.
I think that's how they do it.
Yeah.
And I was like, I want to be in the high pass or honors range, which I was like, okay, I think that's realistic for me.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I did this entire year.
Nice.
There were some exams that I scored lower than others, but I had to pull myself back and be like, okay, I'm still on track for my goals.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I also think that the goals need to be realistic. So if I would have been like, I need to be the top 1% of my class, I know that that's like not even physically capable within my body. Like that's just not the type of person that I am.
Sure. Yeah.
But I set a realistic goal, and if I fell like slightly out of that, or like I scored a little bit lower on an exam,
mm-hmm.
don't compare yourself to others, because somebody else might just be innately ridiculously intelligent, where their goals were like, I do need to be the top 1% of my
mm-hmm.
class, and
mm-hmm.
I am.
Yeah.
Don't compare yourself because you're running different races.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally.
So that's the hard part. But I would say the only thing that you should be comparing yourself is to your own goals that you set.
Yeah, that's huge. I think very similarly. I think that it can be interesting to talk about how things were helpful in getting to a specific score.
Yeah.
But it depends on where that comparison is coming from, because I think that in med school a lot of the time there might not be like intentionally malicious people that are going around and being like, well, I'm the best and
mm-hmm.
this is my score. But you also don't know for sure what everyone else is actually going through.
Right.
Like, I mean, when you're married, you innately have less time. That's just an interesting thing that ends up happening. Or, let's say that, and maybe you're comparing to someone else who, number one, only spends time in their apartment and only cares about their studying.
Right.
Or like just has that exceptional mindset of being able to grind 24/7.
Yeah.
Like there's certain people that have different capacities, especially in med school, and we have to remember as med students that we are inevitably going to have slightly different capacities than other people.
Sure.
And that's okay, because exactly what you're saying, those specific goals for yourself that are attainable are probably the most important thing to compare yourself to.
Yep.
Because you're running your own race.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly.
Totally agree. And, you mentioned it slightly, but maybe not to this effect, but environments are different too.
Mm-hmm.
So, for me, again, I was online and I lived by myself.
Mm-hmm.
So I had to do everything by myself, right? I would wake up, make my own breakfast.
Mm-hmm.
I had to get my own willpower to study all day. I had to do my own grocery shopping. I had to take care of myself.
Yes.
There was other people in my class, and again, this is nothing against them. It's just different environments. But
mm-hmm.
there were people in my class that might have lived at home during this year of online.
Yeah.
So they might not have had to, do all of their own laundry. I don't know.
No, totally.
Or they might not have to do their own grocery shopping or, clean their entire house by themselves.
Mm-hmm.
They might not be married and might
Sure.
not have to spend this extra time with their significant other. Again, if I would have had somebody cooking all of my meals, cleaning my house, doing that kind of stuff, that all of those things take up time in your day.
Yes.
So let's say it takes 2 to 3 hours of your day doing the normal life things that we had to do.
Mm-hmm.
Who's to say that if I didn't have 3 hours of extra study time every day that I couldn't have been in the top 1%?
Sure.
Who knows? Again, it's just different environments.
Yeah.
But a lot of those sacrifices that I made, not even a sacrifice. I love spending time with my fiance.
100%.
Yeah. I was I was happy with the goals that I set and was able to achieve with the amount of work that I put in. If I would have gotten honors this entire year, but had my fiance be angry at me or like felt or she just felt terrible because we never spent time together, well then you're the bad person and nobody really cares if you got honors or not.
Absolutely.
Because you're just
yeah, yeah, and your quality of life is affected by your surroundings to some extent, and the way that you can manage both your internal and external, whatever you're trying to do. The internal and external of those is going to affect how you perform.
Yeah.
And that's okay. That's not an excuse. That's just like one of those things where it's like, okay, this is a reason for how I'm going to perform on exams, and accepting reality around those things is super important. Which means that when you're looking at stuff with regard to your exams, comparing has to be with the accepted reality that you're in. Right. If you're looking at everyone outside of your circle, that might be a few too many people to handle.
Right.
If you're looking at just like your circle of friends that you're actually able to talk to, feel comfortable with, like you can talk about exam scores and not feel like, oh, I'm really just judging myself or like being judged by my friends. That's really helpful sometimes because maybe they noticed something that could help you on the next exam that you didn't do, or like maybe the roles are reversed. That's where I think comparison can be helpful.
Yeah.
When it's in like a team context where you feel comfortable with it.
Right.
But don't feel like you have to tell everyone exactly what your score is if you're worried that they might be looking to needle you with it.
Correct. And there will be people like that.
100%.
Yeah, people will go score hunting. Oh, what did you get on the exam?
Yeah.
Because maybe they scored really high and they just
Yep.
want to feel really good about themselves.
Yep.
So you'll know who those people are, and our recommendation would be to avoid them.
Absolutely. Don't go for it. Don't take the
Yeah.
bait because you will probably not feel as good about yourself.
Yeah. Again, we're big fans of stay in your lane.
Oh yeah. That's so huge. Like, and that's just something that we all need to learn, I think, in society. Stay in your lane.
Yeah. Stay in your lane.
You'll feel better.
Agreed.
What about like what was I saying? We talked about comparison of study habits.
Oh yeah. Okay. Huge one. Again, so our next episode is going to be all about study advice. But again, because David and I are very passionate about studying.
Oh,
and studying
100%.
advice. We love all that kind of nerd stuff. But comparing study habits, I don't think that you should be comparing study habits, because I think that you just need to find what works for you and then stick to it. Like, don't feel bad if you're like, one of your classmates is, studying until 1 a.m. every single morning.
Yep.
Well, if that doesn't work for you, then, don't do it. Then don't do it. Yeah. Everybody studies differently. Like, your study habits in medical school is almost like a thumbprint.
Oh yeah.
Because it's literally like everybody is different. Nobody does the exact same thing as somebody else. Like myself, I'm a big Anki user, but my study habits aren't the same as the On King himself.
For sure.
Like we still do completely different things.
Yeah.
Like you can take bits and pieces of things that you've heard. You're like, oh, maybe I'll try that. Or, I'll take this from this person. Or I'm like, oh, David does this. Maybe I'll try that. And then you kind of just pick and choose what you want, like a buffet, and you put it all on your plate. And, you see if that works for you.
Yeah. Yeah, no, totally. I 100% agree with that. I think that when you go to med school, a lot of the time, the feeling is that you have to find the perfect study thing and that everyone else is going to be doing it.
Right.
That's silly.
Agreed.
Everyone else is just as worried about that as you. They might just not be having that external conversation with you about it.
Yeah.
Like, for me, I really had to adjust the way that I was studying throughout the semester, or well, throughout the year really, because what I was doing wasn't up to the realistic expectation that I had for myself. I wasn't trying to be 1%. I hope that that's pretty obvious, but like, I wanted to be where you were thinking, pass high pass range.
Right.
And you get a lot of really bad advice from really well-intentioned people.
Agreed.
When you're just comparing, because like sometimes people learn differently than you.
Yeah.
And I'm not gonna start saying like, oh, there's all these learning styles, shall we say? Because that's not scientifically accurate even. You know, but people will talk about them and be like, oh, you know, I'm a kinesthetic learner and I do this X, Y, and Z. That doesn't help. Yeah. Having your specific style and being willing to have the confidence to stay in your lane. Right? With that is going to make your life way better.
Agreed.
And that's something that everyone should look at and not feel compelled to compare themselves about, because ultimately, if you have your thing and it's working for you, it's working for you.
Right.
And maybe this other guy over here only does like flashcards, physical flashcards. That's what he does. It makes sense to him. Maybe you use Anki specifically, and that works for you. As long as you're performing well, that's what you need.
Exactly.
So
yeah, and like it can be like a quantity type thing as well. When you see people, they're like, oh my gosh, you know, I studied for 12 hours today. And you're like, dang, dude, I like, you know, went for a walk this morning and then I did some errands and I only studied for like 4 hours today. I'm like, am I a bad person?
No.
It's like, no, you're not. Again, it's, you know, it's an environmental difference. It's just a lifestyle difference. Like, as long as you're doing well, like let's say you took an exam and you bombed it. You got like a 30. You got like a 30 on the exam, right? And you continue to do the same thing. So like you're like, oh, even though I got a 30 on my last exam, I'm still gonna go for a 7-hour hike with my friends this weekend, and then go out to eat and do all these things.
That sounds fun.
Then it does sound fun. Then the comparison, you know, you could kind of be like, oh, you know, everybody else is studying. I should probably do that as well. But if you're doing well and, you know, you're doing within your range, again, you know, if you want to pass and you're doing, you know, 5 above and 5 below that or whatever, you know, you're in your range, you're still doing well. You know, study habits and study time is not really a thing that even needs to be compared.
Oh, that's so important. Yeah, exactly. Because, like, sometimes you have people that are super inefficient in what they're doing.
Yes.
And it takes them, like, 12 hours.
Agreed.
And they might know the exact same amount as you, but you got there in 4 hours because you have a more efficient method.
Agreed.
For yourself.
Agreed.
That's super important because you don't know exactly what's going on for them.
Agreed.
Like, maybe they had to spend that amount of time to survive.
Yes.
You don't know. Because, again, like, people might not be malicious about it, but sometimes they just don't tell you the whole story about what's going on.
Yep.
So, yeah.
I love it.
Me too. Any other thoughts about, like, first year and expectations or realizations?
I think, you know, kind of just to sum it up, because we're coming up on the hour mark.
Yeah.
For me, again, set realistic expectations. The first being, it's going to be hard. And it's going to be different than undergrad. Like, don't even just try to lie to yourself and be like, oh, you know, maybe. No.
Yeah.
It's going to be hard.
Yep.
And it's going to be different than undergrad or graduate school. You know, whatever background you came from. Have the expectation that you're going to want to compare yourself to others, but try to not do that. And remember, everybody is running their own race.
Yep.
Like, everybody has the same end point. And everybody gets there differently. So, you know, if you're running a race and some dude starts running to the left, but you're like, dang, over to the right, you know, looks a little bit nicer to me. Don't just run to the left because everybody else started running to the left.
Yep.
You know, again, stay in your lane, you know, set realistic expectations for yourself.
Yes. And
pick and choose wisely who you accept your advice from.
Oh, yeah. It's huge.
And pick your friends. Pick your friends properly and well as well.
I like it. I think that's a really good sum. You know, don't be a lemming. Have the right, you know, be choosy about who you have your friendships with, who you're willing to spend time with, and set your expectations well.
Agreed.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, dude, if you want to follow us on social media, we do have an Instagram, although it is very low key right now.
Yep.
It's going to be at the Biomed Bros on Instagram. So give us a follow. If you like this podcast, you know, rate it well. Yep. That'll help project it to other people if they want to hear it. And we're excited to interact with you guys online.
Yep. And we will see you guys on the next episode where we talk about all of our study advice.
Exactly.
So we'll see you guys then.
Mm-hmm.